On the freezing night of December 25, 1991, the crimson banner of the Soviet Union descended slowly from the Kremlin flagpole for the final time in history. To observers watching from across the globe, this solemn ceremony appeared to be the dramatic conclusion of a long political struggle and a triumph for democratic ideals. However, hidden deep within the dusty ledger books of the Ministry of Finance, a far more pragmatic and devastating story was waiting to be told to the world. The mighty Soviet Union did not ultimately perish because of a failed ideology or a violent revolution, but rather because it simply ran out of money. This narrative chronicles the single greatest bankruptcy in the history of human civilization, revealing how a global superpower lost everything in a financial storm. It is the tragic tale of a colossal empire that possessed 40,000 frightening nuclear warheads, yet could not afford to buy enough bread for its citizens. This history serves as a brutal lesson on what happens when a powerful nation becomes hopelessly addicted to a single natural resource for its economic survival. To truly understand how a global superpower goes completely broke, we must rewind the clock to the specific moment when they believed they were wealthier than God. The year was 1965, and in the frozen, desolate wastelands of Western Siberia, a team of determined Soviet geologists made a discovery that changed everything. Buried beneath the permafrost, they found the Samotlor field, which was not just an oil deposit, but a literal subterranean sea of liquid black gold. At the time, this discovery seemed like a divine miracle, because the centralized communist economy was already showing dangerous signs of stagnation and inefficiency. Suddenly, the leadership realized they did not need to produce high-quality automobiles or televisions to survive. They only needed to drill deep holes into the frozen ground. Throughout the 1970s, the global price of oil skyrocketed to unprecedented levels, transforming the Soviet economic landscape into a mirage of endless prosperity. The OPEC embargo against the West sent energy prices through the roof, and the Soviet Union unexpectedly became the single biggest beneficiary of this global crisis. Billions of dollars in hard currency flooded into Moscow, representing the greatest winning lottery ticket ever cashed in the long history of the Russian state. Yet, this immense wealth was actually a terrible curse in disguise, as the easy oil money allowed the Soviet leadership to ignore the rotting foundation. Why would the government bother to reform inefficient factories or modernize agriculture when they could simply sell crude oil to the West for instant cash? The Soviet Union transformed into a petrostate, essentially becoming a third-world economy that happened to possess first-world rockets and a massive military-industrial complex. They stopped manufacturing goods that the rest of the world wanted to buy, choosing instead to export raw materials while importing almost everything else they needed. They were effectively trading the blood of the earth for food, for machines, and for the silence of a population that was slowly losing its future. The leadership in the Kremlin cynically utilized this massive oil windfall to purchase the loyalty of a population that had stopped believing in communism. They heavily subsidized basic food prices to keep bread artificially cheap and maintained housing costs at practically zero to prevent social unrest. They also poured vast fortunes into their satellite states across Eastern Europe, essentially paying them to remain within the Soviet orbit. Simultaneously, they constructed a gargantuan military machine that voraciously consumed nearly 20% of the nation's total gross domestic product. It appeared to be a golden age of stability and power. Yet, the entire imperial structure was built upon a foundation of shifting sand. The existential stability of the Soviet Union was now dangerously pegged to a single volatile number: the global price of a barrel of oil. As long as crude oil traded above $30 a barrel, the Soviets were rich enough to mask their deep systemic failures. Flush with petrodollars, they felt invincible enough to invade Afghanistan, believing they could absorb the cost of a protracted war. They possessed the financial confidence to threaten Western Europe with intermediate-range missiles and project power across the globe. They could even afford to stubbornly race the Americans into space, maintaining the illusion of technological parity with the United States. However, as the calendar turned to the early 1980s, the fundamental economic mathematics began to change in ways the Kremlin ignored. The United States and Saudi Arabia were watching closely, realizing that the terrifying Soviet bear was actually a vulnerable economic invalid. They recognized that the superpower had become a junkie, and its drug of choice was dangerously high international oil prices. In the ruthless commodities markets of London and New York, a perfect storm was quietly gathering on the horizon. The global demand for oil was dropping significantly as the West adapted to previous crises by becoming far more energy efficient. Simultaneously, massive new supplies of oil were coming online from the North Sea and the Alaskan slope, flooding the market. The price began to wobble precariously, sending the first tremors of fear through the Soviet planners who relied on that income. To make matters worse, the Soviet domestic agricultural sector collapsed at the exact moment the country could least afford it. This is the forgotten tragedy. The Soviet Union possessed the incredibly fertile black earth of Ukraine, yet could not feed itself. The collective farm system was so hopelessly inefficient that nearly half the potato harvest would rot in the fields before reaching consumers. Consequently, the desperate superpower was forced to swallow its pride and purchase millions of tons of grain from abroad. The ultimate irony was that they were buying this life-saving food from their greatest enemy, the United States. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was spending nearly half of its hard currency earnings on grain imports. They were trapped in a cycle of selling oil to the West just to buy wheat from the West. It was a humiliating loop of dependency that slowly eroded the perceived self-sufficiency of the communist state. Yet the Kremlin leadership remained unconcerned, hypnotized by the black ink on their oil revenue charts. They foolishly believed the party would last forever, unaware that the music was about to stop abruptly. They did not realize they were walking blindfolded on the edge of a cliff while the ground crumbled. The year is 1985, and Mikhail Gorbachev enters the Kremlin, young, energetic, and eager for reform. He knows the system is stagnant, but even he does not realize the severity of the impending collapse. He believes the Soviet economy has a mild cold, when in reality, it is dying of terminal cancer. Gorbachev announces perestroika, a grand restructuring plan designed to modernize the economy and revitalize industry. He plans to invest heavily in machine building and technology to make Soviet factories competitive on a global scale. To pay for this massive investment, he needs liquid cash and assumes the oil revenue will fund it. He is tragically wrong, for the geopolitical winds are shifting in the deserts of the Middle East. On September 13, 1985, Saudi oil minister Ahmed Zaki Yamani makes a decision that changes history. Saudi Arabia declares it is tired of restricting its own production just to keep global prices high. They decide to open the taps, flooding the global market with an overwhelming supply of cheap crude oil. The result is an economic massacre, sending shockwaves through the commodities markets that devastate the Soviet budget. In 1980, oil was $35 a barrel, but by 1986, it crashes to $10. For the Soviet Union, this drastic drop in revenue was not just an economic setback, it was an immediate death sentence. In the blink of an historical eye, the colossal empire suddenly lost half of its indispensable hard currency income. Imagine suddenly losing half your salary, but your mortgage, car payments, and grocery bills all remain exactly the same. The entire Soviet national budget was disastrously calculated based on the assumption of perpetually expensive crude oil. Suddenly, there was a massive, gaping hole in the ledger books, as tens of billions of dollars simply evaporated. This financial catastrophe struck at the absolute worst possible moment for the already strained Soviet leadership. The Soviet Union was hopelessly bogged down in a costly, demoralizing war in the mountains of Afghanistan. They were hemorrhaging millions of dollars a day to prop up friendly communist regimes in Cuba, Vietnam, and Angola. They were desperately trying to maintain nuclear parity with America's technologically advanced new Star Wars defense program. Crucially, they still had to buy massive amounts of foreign grain to keep their population from starving. The grain ships arrived in Odessa every single week, demanding immediate payment in hard currency, either dollars or gold. The Soviets could not pay these international debts in rubles because their domestic currency was essentially worthless outside their borders. It was a soft currency, meaning you couldn't use rubles to buy American wheat, German machines, or Japanese technology. To survive in the global market, the communist superpower desperately needed real money, which they no longer possessed. Therefore, Mikhail Gorbachev faced an impossible choice that would determine the future fate of the entire Soviet system. He could drastically cut military spending to save money, a move that would furiously anger powerful army generals. He could cut expensive food subsidies, which would inevitably anger the populace and potentially spark dangerous riots. Alternatively, he could choose to borrow vast sums of money from Western financial institutions to bridge the gap. Gorbachev ultimately chose to borrow, initiating a massive accumulation of debt from German, French, and British banks. These Western lenders were initially happy to lend because they still believed a nuclear superpower could not possibly go bankrupt. The international loans flowed freely into Moscow, but this influx of cash was not being used for its intended purpose. This was not strategic investment capital being used to build modern factories that would generate healthy profits in the future. Instead, this was desperate survival money, burned immediately just to keep the lights on and the population from rioting. The Soviet Union was essentially borrowing billions of dollars simply to buy food and consumer goods to fill empty shelves. It was a classic credit card spiral where a debtor takes out new high-interest loans just to pay for groceries. To make matters significantly worse, Gorbachev launched a well-intentioned domestic campaign that accidentally accelerated the economic collapse. He correctly identified that rampant alcoholism was destroying the health and productivity of the average Soviet worker. In a bold move, he restricted sales hours, closed liquor stores, and tragically ordered the destruction of ancient vineyards. Morally, it was undoubtedly the right thing to do, but economically, it was an act of pure suicide. The state tax on vodka sales was historically one of the largest reliable sources of revenue, second only to oil. By effectively banning legal alcohol sales, Gorbachev instantly wiped out another massive chunk of the already shrinking national budget. Furthermore, the Russian people did not stop drinking. They simply started brewing dangerous moonshine in their own bathtubs. Consequently, sugar completely disappeared from grocery stores because ordinary citizens were buying it all to distill homemade alcohol. By 1988, the national budget deficit was spiraling completely out of control, with no safety net in sight. The desperate government began doing the one thing that every economist knows you should absolutely never do. They turned on the printing presses, frantically churning out millions of new rubles to pay workers' wages. But because there were no actual goods in the shops to buy, this flood of paper money just piled up uselessly. This created a phenomenon called a monetary overhang, where people had pockets full of cash but nothing to spend it on. The shortage economy kicked into high gear, forcing people to stand in freezing lines for 4 hours for bread. If a Soviet citizen saw a queue forming, they would join it immediately, without even asking what was being sold. Consumers would blindly purchase shoes, sausages, or toilet paper without hesitation, simply because the items were physically present. The prevailing mentality was to hoard whatever you could immediately, because by tomorrow morning it would inevitably be gone. Consequently, the unwritten social contract that had bound the Soviet people to their government began to fracture. For decades, the population had silently tolerated the suppression of political freedom in exchange for guaranteed economic stability. They accepted censorship because they enjoyed cheap rent, guaranteed employment, and heavily subsidized basic food items. But now that the stability was gone, the shelves were bare, and the money in their pockets was worthless. Meanwhile, the international banking community in London and Frankfurt began to view their star client with growing suspicion. Astute financial analysts noticed that the Soviet Union was borrowing new money just to pay interest on old loans. The national debt had exploded from almost zero to a staggering $50 billion in just a few years. Western bankers finally realized that the communist emperor had no clothes, and more importantly, he had no cash. By 1989, the Soviet economy was not merely stalling, it was actively disintegrating before the world's eyes. The Berlin Wall crumbled, and the satellite states of Eastern Europe began to break free from Moscow's orbit. To the outside world, these dramatic events looked like a glorious celebration of political liberation and democracy. However, to the terrified accountants inside the Kremlin, this geopolitical shift represented an absolute financial catastrophe. For decades, the Soviet Union had forced Eastern Europe to trade within a closed, artificial economic loop. Suddenly, these newly independent nations refused to accept rubles and demanded to be paid in hard US dollars. The entire communist trading bloc collapsed overnight, severing the intricate supply chains that kept the Soviet economy alive. Inside the Kremlin, a cold panic set in as the leadership realized their safety nets were gone. The legendary gold reserves, once the pride of the state, began to vanish from the central vault. By 1990, secret flights were transporting tons of gold bars to London and Zurich in desperate midnight runs. They sold so much bullion so rapidly that they accidentally depressed the global gold price, receiving even less value for their desperation. Then came the final internal blow known as the War of Laws, which shattered the political unity of the entire Union. The individual Soviet republics, led by Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltics, began to deliberately withhold tax revenue from the central government. Boris Yeltsin, the rebellious leader of the Russian Republic, explicitly instructed his tax collectors to keep the money in local coffers. His order was simple and devastating. Do not send a single ruble up the chain of command to President Gorbachev. Consequently, the central Soviet budget completely evaporated, leaving the federal government with zero operating capital. Gorbachev remained the president of a nuclear superpower, yet he literally had no income to run the state. He commanded the most fearsome nuclear arsenal on Earth, but he could not pay the wages of the guards watching them. In 1990, the unthinkable finally happened when the Soviet Union began defaulting on its commercial shipping payments. Cargo ships loaded with frozen meat and butter dropped anchor off the coast of Leningrad and refused to dock. The furious captains radioed the port authorities that they would not unload a single crate until the check cleared. But the checks were bouncing, and the food remained rotting in the hull while the people on shore went hungry. The Soviet government was forced to go to the West with hat in hand, begging for immediate humanitarian aid. It was a profound humiliation for a proud nation that had sacrificed millions to defeat Hitler's armies. The country that had launched the first man into space was now asking Germany for charity care packages of powdered milk. The Vnesheconombank, the state bank responsible for foreign economic affairs, suddenly froze all corporate accounts without warning. Soviet companies that had successfully earned hard currency through legitimate trade woke up one morning to find their accounts empty. The desperate state had simply confiscated their private funds to pay the interest on the sovereign national debt. It was theft on a massive national scale, and it completely destroyed any remaining trust in the banking system. The ruble effectively ceased to function as money, causing the entire economy to regress into a primitive barter system. Factories began paying their confused workers in goods they produced, handing out truck tires or crystal vases instead of cash wages. Desperate employees stood on the freezing sides of highways trying to trade a set of industrial tires for a bag of potatoes. The black market rapidly transformed into the only functioning market, while the official state economy became little more than a hollow shell. The American dollar became the only currency that mattered, reigning supreme as the unofficial monarch of the Soviet streets. Taxi drivers, prostitutes, and waiters became the new financial elite because they had direct access to foreign cash tips. Meanwhile, distinguished university professors and nuclear scientists were reduced to paupers, their life savings wiped out by inflation. In August 1991, hardline communists launched a desperate coup against Gorbachev, parking tanks in the middle of Red Square. They wanted to restore strict order and turn back the clock to a time when the party was supreme. However, the plotters forgot one fundamental truth about reality. You can shoot people, but you cannot shoot the laws of economics. The coup leaders had plenty of tanks, but they had absolutely no plan to put food back on the empty shelves. The coup collapsed quickly because the plotters realized they were fighting to be the captain of the Titanic. They were violently struggling for control of the wheel while the ship was already submerged deep beneath the icy water. When Gorbachev returned to power after the failed coup, he was a political ghost haunting the halls of the Kremlin. Real power had decisively shifted to Boris Yeltsin and the republics, but the crushing weight of the national debt remained. The Western banks and the G7 nations called an emergency meeting, terrified that their billions were about to disappear forever. The crumbling Soviet Union owed nearly $70 billion, and lenders were panicked about who would actually repay it. If the country broke apart into 15 separate nations, who would be responsible for the bills? Ukraine, Kazakhstan, or Russia? The Western creditors demanded a strict joint and several responsibility agreement from the squabbling Soviet republics. They bluntly told the emerging leaders that they did not care who was in charge, but someone had to sign. In the final cold months of 1991, the Soviet Union existed only on paper, a legal fiction without funds. There was absolutely no money available for the November payroll, forcing millions of state employees to work without receiving their wages. By December, the situation had worsened, and there were no funds left to pay salaries, pensions, or even the military. The government printing presses ran continuously for 24 hours a day, churning out large denomination banknotes that nobody wanted. Hyperinflation had officially arrived, meaning the paper used to print the money was often more valuable than the currency itself. By December 1991, Gosbank, the central bank of the Soviet Union, was declared completely and irrevocably insolvent. They had literally run out of gold, a shocking revelation for a superpower rumored to possess thousands of tons. Investigating prosecutors later discovered only about 240 tons of gold remaining in the once overflowing national vault. The rest had been frantically sold, stolen, or wasted in a desperate, futile attempt to keep the system afloat. On December 25th, Mikhail Gorbachev sat at his heavy wooden desk to sign the document finalizing his resignation. He did not resign because he was conquered by an invading army, but because he had lost the ability to write checks. The Soviet Union officially ceased to exist as a geopolitical entity, but the ghost of the empire lingered in the debt. The new Russian Federation, led by Boris Yeltsin, stepped forward to inherit the permanent seat at the United Nations. Along with the diplomatic prestige, Russia inherited the nuclear launch codes and the command of a vast, unpaid military. However, the most significant inheritance was the crushing financial burden that had destroyed the previous communist regime. Russia agreed to a deal known as the Zero Option, taking on 100% of the Soviet foreign debt. In exchange for shouldering this burden, Russia claimed ownership of all Soviet foreign assets, including embassies and trade missions. It seemed like a fair trade on paper, but the immediate reality was a financial anchor around the neck of the new state. This massive debt burden instantly strangled the new democratic government, making economic recovery nearly impossible for the next decade. The infamous shock therapy economic reforms that followed were a direct, unavoidable result of this absolute state bankruptcy. There was simply no money left in the treasury to cushion the painful transition from communism to capitalism. Government subsidies were slashed overnight, causing the prices of basic food items to skyrocket by 2,000%. The accumulated life savings of millions of ordinary Russian citizens were completely wiped out in a matter of days. The poverty that followed was horrific, but it was not caused by the political collapse of 1991. Instead, this suffering was the delayed consequence of the fatal economic addiction that began in the 1970s. The agonizing pain of the 1990s was simply the inevitable withdrawal symptom from the nation's high oil dependency. It took many painful years for the Russian Federation to slowly climb out of this deep financial hole. In 1998, Russia defaulted again, crashing global markets once more before finally finding its economic footing. It was not until global oil prices started to rise again in the 2000s that the debts cleared. In 2017, Russia finally paid off the last remaining debt of the Soviet Union to Bosnia-Herzegovina. It took 26 long years to finally close the accounting books on the fallen Soviet debt empire. The fall of the Soviet Union stands as the ultimate cautionary tale of the dreaded resource curse. It teaches us the hard lesson that possessing abundant natural resources is not the same as having economic strength. The Soviets thought they were rich because they had oil, tragically confusing geological luck with economic genius. They built a superpower on a foundation of commodities, pegging their survival to a number on a trading screen. When that number dropped, neither the KGB nor the 40,000 nuclear warheads could save them from ruin. An empire that cannot afford to pay for its own bread is not a superpower, but a ticking time bomb. In the end, the Cold War was not won by a ballistic missile or a space race victory. It was won by a humble grain shipment that the bankrupt Soviet government simply could not afford to buy. The hammer and sickle did not fall because of a conqueror, it fell because it went bankrupt. I'm John. This is Cinematic History Tales. Subscribe now to understand the past before it repeats itself.